All right. Well, this week we are here to talk about the Palo Alto School District budget and the shortfall that it's facing. And we're really happy to have board member Todd Collins with us to help us unpack some of what's going on. Todd, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I understand you're speaking not on behalf of the board.
That's right. All school board members have, the board only speaks as a body when it votes. And so I'm just speaking for myself today.
Yeah. Again, thanks for being here to share your expertise. So hopefully this will be a little bit of Budget 101 for us. Last summer, there was a shortfall that was revealed. It was initially $5.2 million of a $231 million budget, which effectively meant it was $3.7 million in a budget gap. Now we are, this week with the budget discussion, we're at $8.8 million shortfall that will be addressed over 4 years. To me, that sounds like a growth in a shortfall, but I know there's a lot of complexities in it. So I was hoping that you could start us off with just kind of a little bit of an explanation of how we got from there to here.
Sure. Yeah, so actually, for the most part, things have stayed the same, but it's very confusing because the numbers move around a lot. To remind everybody, what started this is that we passed a teacher's contract in the spring of last year that guaranteed the raises in advance.
For 3 years.
For 3 years, though, the third year was contingent on certain property value growth. But this year was guaranteed in advance. And what happened is shortly thereafter, we found out that the property tax projection that we had was too high, and that it was actually coming in meaningfully lower. So that generated the $5.2 million gap for this year, which we found out about just a few weeks after the fiscal year began in July. Since that time, we've been, the district worked to close the gap just for this year, which they did almost exclusively with using reserves and borrowing using bond funds. So there were almost no cuts in expenses this year. And there was a plan to cut expenses for next year. And that's what we've been working through, where there are a list of proposed cuts that now total about $3.5 million that the staff has produced. The $8.6 million, $8.4 million that I mentioned at the last meeting is actually a number that's been around for a while. That's what I think people don't recognize is we don't just have a budget deficit this year, but per the projections that the staff has prepared, we have a deficit this year, then a further deficit next year, then a further deficit the year after that, and then a further deficit the year after that. We show 4 years of deficits, and that's assuming a maximum of 1% raise for staff. Each of the nothing this year and nothing next year, and 1% for each of the next 3 years.
And is that because the expenses are just carrying over without being addressed year after year after year?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we always start with the budget that we had and just make incremental changes. And that's frankly one of the things that I think some of the board members would like to see changed is kind of look at things a little more fundamentally, not just go along with what last year's budget was, but really try to examine some of our practices and priorities and see if we can make changes.
So despite the multi-year deficit projections, which the district itself has made, district staff has talked about, this is a 2-year plan and has said, we're confident we can address the budget in 2 years and we'll be fine. What's the sort of disconnect there? And do you think that there needs to be sort of a shift in approach or attitude from the district about the longevity of the deficit?
I do. The future is uncertain, and the projections are the forecast is always based on assumptions primarily about property tax growth that are, anybody's guess. The one thing we know is that the projection will almost certainly be wrong. We just don't know if it'll be high or low. As everybody knows, our property tax growth tends to go like this. And we've had several years of record property tax growth. We had 11% 2 years ago. We had almost 9% last year. Those are really high historical numbers. So I think everyone anticipates that it's going to come down. And the scenario that the board has recommended using, and Melissa Batten-Caswell, every time she talks about it, says we should be using Scenario C. Scenario C is a conservative projection that projects something like 3% growth every year. That's the projection that generates losses, shortfalls, each of the next 4 years. And so I do think we have to change it. Our perspective has been, let's just look at next year, 1 year at a time. And when you're facing just 1 year shortfall, that's appropriate. But when you've got 5 years of shortfalls in front of you, you really need to change your perspective and say, how are we going to change our economic model?
So this week, the staff brought some suggested cuts to the board, and those included some staff issues, right? And then
From the district, and then, and it's all proposed at
district
this
level.
point. Yeah, and also restructuring of teacher leadership positions, instructional supervisors, and sort of a changing of, which I see as cuts as pretty close to the classroom.
Yeah.
We can talk about that later, but yeah, those were the biggest chunks from the district office cuts, which they haven't really specified, but just eliminating and consolidating positions at the district.
So those sound like structural cuts. Those sound like things that can actually have an impact year after year after year that we won't have to chase.
They help. The 1.2 million in district office expenses is basically consolidating and eliminating positions. So that's just headcount cuts. Those are absolutely necessary. I mean, we are top heavy at the district office, and we need to address that. We've added a lot of staff in the last 4 years away from the classroom, almost $7-8 million of annual expense. And that's what we really have to go after. We added when times were good, and now we've got to pull back because we overextended.
Yeah. You mentioned process a little bit earlier, so I wanted to talk about how has the district been able to decide or recommend where to cut, and get your take kind of on whether or not this is effective and comprehensive enough. There were town hall meetings last year.
Yeah,
Can you
there were
step us through
2
that?
in September, town hall webinars that Max held, and then there was a study session in October, which I believe was at the last sort of dedicated meeting
It was.
on the budget. Yeah,
Yeah.
and since then, the issue has gone a little
Yeah.
dark. I don't know if there's been a lot of behind the scenes meetings with groups like PTA and PI between staff, or we are curious what the process has been since then.
Well, I was curious too, and I asked about that actually when I met with Max before the last meeting. And the answer is there has not been as much as I would have anticipated. There was a lot of talk last year about a thorough, thoughtful, inclusive process. And I think people had in mind something where there would be meetings at the local schools and people would pitch in all kinds of ideas that would get evaluated, which actually did happen back in 2009
Right.
when they had a real significant sudden deficit. For the most part, that has not happened. Kathy Mack has had limited meetings with, I think, PTA, council leadership, and with PI leadership, maybe one meeting each. And then there have been meetings with among the senior members of the leadership team at the school district, just as you might expect. But there's been no kind of open, inclusive process to try to really brainstorm what our priorities are. As a result, we got a limited and inwardly looking set of recommendations. We're going to cut headquarters staff. We're going to cut administrators and ISs. We're going to find some little pockets of things to cut. And frankly, the biggest disappointment is the recommendations to cut basically were the same as the amount that needed to be cut. So the board was being told that the recommendation, if you have to take 90% of our recommendations if you want to bridge the gap.
Yeah.
Well, and what Ken and I and others asked for was, hey, we need to see a lot more options here.
And you both have asked for that before. I was just looking back at my notes from past discussions on this, and almost
Every
word
time.
for word, these kind of we just need more options.
Yeah, and I think the idea is, and the board actually took a step that they hadn't taken before, which is we made a motion and passed it to direct staff to generate $2 million of additional proposed program cuts, which is, I think was basically what was being asked for before, but we haven't gotten it.
Mm-hmm.
So now the board's directed staff to do that, and staff said that they will.
Yeah.
You said there was a campaign debate actually that we hosted and before you were elected, and you said something about, and that was a different point in the budget process, but you said that there wasn't any room for additional fun, innovative things that people in the community want, and the district has been planning. Do you still see that as a problem for the district? Sort of, is this going to put a lot of pressure on things like social emotional learning curriculum or the renaming schools issue, things that are in the pipeline that a lot of people want to see happen and are just moving forward despite what's going on with the budget?
Absolutely. That's going to be a big problem, and I think we have not come to grips with it yet. It was even at the last meeting where PACCC, the group that does after school care and preschool care at most of the campuses, came in. They have a $400,000 budget shortfall and asked us to help support it. We got nothing. We got to make $3.5 million of cuts, and they're asking for $400,000 in addition. That's fine, we could do it, but then we have to find $3.9 million in cuts. So everything that comes in that's going to be a new additional expense that wasn't in the budget this year is going to have to be offset by a cut or funded out of reserves. And that's the reality that we're in. And the point I tried to make at the meeting is that's the reality we'll be in this year, next year, and every year for as long as my term goes. So it's a change.
Yeah. One of the things that it's not on the table, correct me if I'm wrong, is the compensation for the teachers for this year and next year. And then also for the district administration, because there was that Me Too clause that they got the same raises.
So yes and no. For this year, the teachers' raises are set. For next year, the teachers' raises will be renegotiated because there was a band about property tax growth, and if the property tax growth fell below a certain level, it would be renegotiated. It looks like it will fall below that level, so it'll be renegotiated.
Okay.
The district staff is penciling in 0. I don't know if 0 will be appropriate or not. I think we have to look at the market and look at what it takes to retain and recruit the kind of teachers we want. The staff, the senior staff, the senior administrator, Me Too raises are an open item. We control the board and the senior and the superintendent control what those raises are, control what that compensation is.
And that's a year-by-year thing.
And that's a year-by-year
Okay.
thing. So the Me Too was by custom, not by contract.
Okay.
So-
And so that could be something that comes back as part of this $2 million that you have asked, that
Yes.
the board has asked for.
It absolutely could.
Yeah.
What would you like to see on the list that comes to the next meeting that hasn't been proposed already?
Well, I've tried very hard not. It's not the board's role to tell the superintendent how to run the district, and so saying, "Hey, I think you should cut this or cut that," is in some sense inappropriate and gives too much visibility to things that board members may pick on, but the superintendent might think are very important. So I don't want to overstep by saying, "Hey, here are some obvious things," but there are things that I think could be thought about that I think staff is open to thinking about that we haven't thought about before. For instance, one thing is outsourcing functions that are done by classified staff today, and that are not essential to our educational mission. And things that others have done include meal services, transportation, landscaping, building maintenance, even IT, where we today use employees. And the other thing that came up at the meeting that I'm sure you guys noticed was that our pension expenses are continuing to go up as CalSTRS and CalPERS, the two pension funds, reduce their predicted returns, which increases the amount every district has to contribute. So employees are becoming more and more expensive, which means that outsourcing may be something that we can do. Now, there's a lot of issues with outsourcing, both ethical issues as well as staff relationship issues and the economic issues. So it's not something we're going to do on a whim. But I do think we're to the point where we need to fundamentally look at some of the ways we've done things and see if we can find a better way.
Yeah, I know the city has done some outsourcing as well, just to try to keep those pension costs.
I'm going to try to talk to them about that. I'm going to find out how they did it.
Yeah, get a little bit of experience and advice from them. Going forward, I'm wondering about the process, because it sounded to me so the senior administration went off and talked to Teachers Union, Classified Union, PTA, PI, and that information wasn't integrated into the board discussion, kind of on an ongoing basis. So these proposals came to you sort of fait accompli, and you weren't part of the process. Do you see a different possible process moving forward to discuss? I know you've already requested the $2 million cuts, but future process, can it be improved upon? Should there be?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about it that way, and it might be appropriate. I think what happens is we're treating it. There are two kinds of deficits. There's a deficit where you overspend. You go out and splurge on something. You buy your Christmas gifts, and then for January you eat ramen noodles for a month until your credit cards are paid off. And we kind of treat, most of our issues historically have been like that, where we overspend a little bit, but if we rein in for a year or two, it catches up. I'm concerned that this is not the same. This is like we've had a permanent reduction in revenue, and we've significantly increased our costs. And that's why we see this kind of structural deficit that we haven't historically seen. And I think the factors that led to it, which are the cost of living in California, the cost of living in the Valley, the shortage of teachers that is a statewide thing that affects what we have to pay teachers, is going to make it more and more expensive to do what we do, which is hire great teachers. And I think property tax values, which would have gone on a binge, are going to start regressing to the mean. So I think we may be at a point where we need to look at our model a little more fundamentally and think about how we pay people, how we get things done, and how we do our education.
And how do we have that conversation?
Good question. I think it's a long conversation. It won't be solved in 1 year. I don't think there's time for it in this budget cycle. But I think it's something that I hope we'll look at next year.
Anything more to be said about the budget here?
I don't think so. So you guys will talk about it February 28th, and sounds like
And
there
probably
might be
every meeting thereafter.
another meeting in there somewhere added, because the timeline was pretty crunched. It was suggested that you would approve it at the next meeting in March. And
That's not a necessary approval date, though, is it?
No, at the end of the day, the budget has to be approved by the end of the fiscal year, which I mean basically
Yeah,
means
until
June.
June.
And while staff would certainly like more certainty earlier, I think the board's inclined. It's an unusual year, maybe extraordinary year, and we're going to have to take the time to actually figure it out. These are not easy questions. It'll involve. We won't get it done in March. I'm confident of that, and I'm sure there'll be many more meetings to cover.
good to know.
Okay, well, we'll be watching and listening in. So, Todd Collins, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for
Really
having me.
appreciate
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for Behind the Headlines this week. If you would like to subscribe, you can click the button below. We're on paloaltoonline.com. If you want to comment on this issue, you can find the discussion at paloaltoonline.com/square, or follow us on Twitter at Palo Alto Weekly. We'll see you next week.